Good afternoon. I'm pleased to join Senate President Pro Tem Steinberg to unveil the modified California jobs budget, a creative alternative to the Republican budget plan that would saddle Californians with more than 400,000 lost jobs and result in California having the worst unemployment rate in the nation. The California jobs budget reflects the principles that the Pro Tem and I laid out last month, and our focus remains squarely centered on job creation and job retention. Over the last several weeks, you've seen the Republican leadership and the governor go out of their way to attack the mechanics and the process of our plan. But let's be absolutely clear. They are attacking the process because they're unable to impeach our commitment to jobs, and they certainly can't defend the fact that the governor's plan leads to a devastating level of job loss. In the last 7 months since Governor Schwarzenegger unveiled his first budget plan, legislative Republicans have been AWOL. They're deliberately prolonging the process and causing real suffering to score cheap political points, and it's reprehensible behavior that needs to stop immediately. We could have a budget done in 5 minutes if they were willing to come to the table with something more than simple Republican Party talking points. Democrats have been acting responsibly, and we've put forward a plan that reflects the urgent needs of California, not the dictates of party bosses. We have implemented the most open and transparent process in recent memory. We've held over 100 hearings, inviting testimony from every conceivable community impacted by the budget. Assembly Democrats held budget forums throughout California. We went to places like San Diego and Palm Springs, Fresno, and Albany, and invited Californians to both learn about the nature of our budget problems and the various plans to solve them. More than 1,900 Californians attended these forums. They participated in an interactive segment operated by Next 10, a nonpartisan budget institute. Their preferences were overwhelming and consistently clear. Californians value education, we value jobs, we value the safety net for the poor, the sick, and the elderly. We recognize that in these difficult times, painful sacrifices are required by everyone, especially those who've been asked to sacrifice the least. I want to add that the results of the interactive demonstrations are consistent with every public poll on the budget. In fact, a recent field poll shows that 79% of the public, including almost 2/3 of registered Republicans, oppose cutting education to balance the budget. The California jobs budget absolutely reflects the values and priorities of Californians. From the beginning of this process, we've consistently maintained that any responsible budget must meet 3 clear tests. First, it must reflect the values and priorities of the people of California. Second, it must be crafted so that we make decisions that do not do further harm to the economy, most visibly through devastating job losses. Finally, the budget process must be open and transparent, because in these difficult times, the people of California have every right and expectation to know the decisions that their leaders are making. Now, certainly we've been meeting privately. Every business person in the state understands that when you're engaged in complex negotiations, private discussions are integral to rendering an outcome. What we've consistently said is that every plan would be put through the public committee process, and the jobs budget will be sent to the conference committee for public scrutiny. Both Senate and Assembly Democrats unveiled budget plans in response to the governor's job-killing budget announcement in May. We demonstrated that there are realistic alternatives to avoid devastating job losses and cuts to education. Certainly, the original Assembly plan was subject to much scrutiny for how creative our approach was. But because we committed to a public process, we were able to have a thorough discussion about every aspect of both the Assembly and Senate plans and identify areas of concern. That gave us a clearer understanding of what kind of approach we needed to be able to bring realistic solutions and ultimately result in the jobs budget we're announcing today. Our plan is predicated on our commitment to jobs, and we dedicate funding to help small businesses create thousands of new jobs. We understand that imposing tax increases on working families will hurt recovery. So we generate revenue through two alternatives. First, we close a loophole that allows oil companies like BP to drill in California for free. Second, we delay tax breaks for massive corporations that haven't even taken effect yet. And I might add that these tax breaks were extracted in secret as part of backroom budget deals in the Big Five. These corporate giveaways are a case in point for why we're insisting on openness and transparency in the process to avoid cutting these secret backroom special interest deals. The jobs budget implements needed tax reform that brings stability to our revenues, decreases the net tax burdens for Californians at every income bracket, and provides a shot in the arm for Californians' merchants and manufacturers. This is a plan that every Californian can and should support. It reflects the core values of Californians and makes decisions that will help rather than hurt the economy. It keeps 430,000 Californians working and will help small businesses create more jobs. It doesn't impose broad-based taxes, and most importantly, it rejects the Republican slash and burn approach to education. I'm confident that once the California jobs budget has been thoroughly and publicly reviewed, the people of California will understand that there is a clear choice between our plan, which saves and creates jobs, and the Republican plan, which will destroy California's recovery. Thank you. Senator Steinberg will now make a statement, after which we'll take some of your questions, and our budget directors will be available to take questions as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very glad to be standing with you today with a united Democratic approach line by line. There is great urgency to get this done. We put forward this proposal with the hope and the expectation that it will lead to budget closure sooner rather than later. This is not a budget to celebrate. It is a budget of necessity. It is a proposal that reflects our difficult economic times and counts on all Californians to come together in a collective effort to weather this recession and spur our economic recovery. Our proposal makes more than $8 billion in painful cuts, including to public education, but rejects the governor's gratuitous cuts that would devastate our economy, our people, and eliminate, as the Speaker said, hundreds of thousands of jobs. It will help jumpstart the economy by permanently cutting the sales tax nearly in half, and raises new revenue to ensure that our children receive a quality education and our people have a decent quality of life. This is a responsible, balanced, and fair proposal that should be implemented, and implemented quickly. I want to make three key points. And before I make those points, I really believe that context here is important. Because it's one thing if you look at a budget in a single time frame. It's another thing to look at what we as a legislature and governor have done, not just over the past 2 years, but in fact over the past 5 years. Last year, we cut $14.5 billion from the public education budget, $5 billion from California's already fragile safety net. We've detailed those cuts in the past. But that's not all, because if you go back over the previous 5 years, even before last year, we made $845 million of general fund reductions to Social Security disability. We made almost $700 million of cuts to CalWORKs. We cut $360 million from in-home supportive services. We cut over $1 billion in aging programs. The list goes on and on and on. Despite these cuts, we recognize that with a $19 billion deficit, that it is necessary to make more cuts. We reluctantly acknowledge the necessity of suspending Proposition 98. We put forward an intelligent tax reform proposal, which ensures that Washington does its fair share for California and its taxpayers. And as I said earlier, provides an economic shot in the arm by cutting the sales tax almost 50%. I urge you today to talk to Bill Dombrowski, who's somewhere here, from the California retailers and other business leaders about what this kind of sales tax reduction would mean to economic recovery and job creation. It is significant and substantial. We make cuts, as I acknowledge and the Speaker acknowledges, that are necessary. But you know, there's a difference between cutting what is necessary, and especially in light of the history of the last 5 years, and going beyond that. It's almost as if the other side, the Republicans and the governor, view cuts not just as a necessity, but as a virtue in and of itself. Making cuts is not a virtue. It hurts real people. It hurts children who are trying to get a decent education. It hurts college students who are trying to get classes to get their degrees. It hurts public safety who's trying to maintain decent ratio of patrol to citizens in their local communities. Cuts are necessary in this environment, but they certainly aren't a virtue. And so while we make difficult cuts, while we acknowledge, again, the necessity of dealing with Proposition 98, we will not participate and certainly will not agree to a budget that includes cuts that are gratuitous. And so in conclusion, we ask our counterparts here to come forward with something that is credible and intelligent. It's not credible and it's not intelligent to wipe out Health and Human Services in California. It's not intelligent and credible to cut education to a point where the layoffs of last year will pale in comparison to what would be in the future if we allow these cuts to go forward. If you think this tax reform proposal is not perfect, the governor, who has talked for a long time about tax reform, come forward with your own proposal that has some political support. Certainly the Parsky Commission, well-intended, good, hard work. You know, I commend Mr. Parsky, certainly, and the people who served on that commission. But in the end, when they came forward with a business net receipts tax, no one supported it. You want tax reform? We've hit as close to a sweet spot as you will ever find. More revenue for the state, more money from Washington, D.C., a tax cut, net tax cut, for Californians across income sectors. Challenge the governor and the Republicans to come up with a tax reform proposal that meets all three of those criteria. We'd be glad to stand for questions. Thank you.
Do you have the numbers on the taxes, how much the income tax is going to go up, how much the sales tax will go down?
We have it all right here, and we're prepared to
Am I not seeing it?
It's on a different piece of paper in your package.
Those are aggregate numbers in there, but can you talk about, there are going to be instances where people are going to pay higher taxes for sure. I mean, if they don't spend a lot, if they don't itemize, can you address the fact that there are going to be Californians paying higher taxes?
Well, first of all, our modeling, which again, we worked not alone, but we worked with the Franchise Tax Board to develop, shows that across every income sector, there's a net tax decrease. When you add the federal deduction with the sales tax cut, it is greater than the increased personal income tax and the VLF combined. Now, if that's across income levels. Now,
You can never legislate to the individual level.
Right.
All you can do is look at every segment that's perceivable. So what we've looked at is at every income bracket, a net tax decrease to the taxpayer. That's the only way you can legislate. You can't legislate down to the individual because individual behavior doesn't always fit models. And so the current system, the system we propose, you have variation between individuals.
and you know, there's a lot of things, by the way, that we can do much better in terms of drawing down additional federal funds. The earned income tax credit is a great example for low to moderate income taxpayers. We need to come together with the Republicans and the governor to figure out how we make that real for more California families so that these numbers are even better than what's on the page here.
So can you just
quickly, your income tax proposal excludes the top bracket.
It does not exclude the top bracket. The top bracket goes up 0.25%. In other words, it would go down as a matter of law at the end of this year.
But less than others would go.
Correct.
And why is that? Because you've got critics out there who will say, these are the people who can most afford what you're doing. And the people who itemize, by the way.
Two things. One is you want to make sure that you have greater predictability. And so you've seen much consternation about the volatility of income. And quite frankly, right now, we are disproportionately dependent on income from the top earners. So this helps us level out. Quite frankly, there's still a pitch. It's still a progressive tax system, but it decreases the steepness of that pitch. And so it deals with the issue of volatility. And again, the idea is to put together a combination that allows for a net reduction at every income level. If we had done something different, it wouldn't have allowed for a reduction at that income level. So what we found is a sweet spot that results in greater revenues to the state, an increase in federal money that we draw down, and a net decrease in tax obligation for every income bracket. Had we done it differently along the lines that you're talking about, it would have resulted in a net increase for that income bracket, and we were trying to give tax relief at the same time as creating a revenue stream.
And I will say, in terms of progressivity, even with this proposal, California will remain in the top 5 among the 50 states in terms of progressivity, and we'd be glad to get you that particular ranking and information after the event, after the press conference.
Isn't there a disincentive in here to save? I mean, I know you said that you want to spur the economy by lowering the sales tax, but if somebody doesn't spend a lot of money, they're probably not going to benefit because they don't get the sales tax decrease.
No, this is built on a static model. So if people continue to spend in the way in which they do, they get the benefit. If they spend more, they get even greater benefit. But that's individual choices people have to make in terms of their own purchasing. What we wanted to do is make sure that even in a static situation, people had a net reduction of their tax obligation.
The only way you get the revenue neutral.
This isn't revenue neutral.
Tax break. Tax break.
This isn't revenue
tax
neutral.
decrease.
The only way you get the tax break is if it's on the sales tax side, if you don't itemize, right?
No. First of all, the numbers assume that the taxpayers at the lower end itemize at the very rate they currently itemize at. So we're not making any different assumptions about itemization. Even with that consistent rate, it's still a net tax decrease. And so it doesn't depend, the modeling does not depend on increased itemization at the lower to middle income levels.
And after the pro tem and I are done, our budget directors will stick around and can walk you through the details of how each of these play out.
You envision that this is going to take this tax proposal to make a two-thirds vote?
Yes.
Correct.
Yeah, 2/3. It's a 2/3 vote. It's not a majority.
Are you going to put this up for a vote? Do you expect all of your members to vote for this?
We will put this up at some point. We're hopeful that this might get the other side to want to engage a little bit. The silence has been deafening. I mean, the governor puts out a May revise. It is not a credible May revise by virtue of what it seeks to wipe out. It is now August the 3rd, and they have not come forward with any kind of a counter proposal.
So how did you do intend to put this up for a vote?
Well,
do you expect all of your members to vote for this?
Here's what I think needs to be very clear. This is a process that you go through. The next step is now conference committee. Once the conference committee acts on this, then it's eligible for consideration on the floor. The whole intent of doing this is to have something that is prepared for us to be able to vote on.
How did you arrive at the decision to suspend Prop 98? And what do you say to the educators and the interest groups, the unions that like the old proposal that had $2 billion more, and now there's $2 billion more cut?
Look, we would love to be in a position where we had even more money for education. We would love to be in a position where we had more money for a whole variety of things. We're just not in that place realistically. There is a real crisis that we have to respond to. Now, when you look at what we've done two things. We've been honest about what our education obligation is under Prop 98, which is a sharp contrast from the Republican governor's approach. His approach assumed that you could pick any level and say that's where we fund it. You can't do that. If you want to pick a number different than what Prop 98 dictates, then you have to be honest and say this requires a suspension. So we're being honest here and saying that in order to get to the $52 billion level, that you need to do a suspension. Now, we've done that, but we've also done something else that's very important. We've restored roughly $3 billion worth of cuts that the governor would have proposed in his May revise. So we have fully restored all the cuts that the governor proposed, and then been honest in our assessment that this is still below what the constitutional mandate is. So we create the system by which we fund at 52, suspend Prop 98, and put in place the guarantees to pay back the money that's owed to education into the future.
You know, governing is a tough thing. And we continually, as Democrats, step up, make decisions that are very uncomfortable for us. As I say many times, I came to public life to build, not to tear down. But this is reality. It's a $19 billion problem. The problem is there needs to be that same sense of reality on the other side. And as I said a moment ago, we'll cut because we have to, but not because it's a virtue, and we're not going to make cuts that just for the sake of making cuts.
Are you sending more state prisoners to local jails, and how are you going to pay for that? How are the locals going to get money? It says a funding source here. Is that what this refers to?
This is the VLF. We do have a realignment proposal in here consistent with the principles embodied in the original Senate proposal. And what we seek to do is to essentially give a block grant to counties for wobbler crimes, and say to the counties that you have a choice. You can either keep them at the county level, either in county jail or in some form of alternative custody or probation, and we think we can pay a high enough reimbursement rate that they will have an incentive to want to keep the wobblers at the county level, or you can send them to state prison, but then you have to give the money back. And so over time, we think this creates the right sorts of incentives consistent with corrections reform, same thing we've been talking about for the last several years. And the revenue, of course, part of the revenue will be used to fund that block grant so that counties have that choice.
Darryl, your budget has $4 billion of additional federal money. The governor started out with 7, he dropped it to 3, 4. All the work from Washington is that all that extra health and welfare money that people were counting on ain't happening. Where do you get the $4 billion?
Well, we don't think that is that's a final conclusion yet. We talked to Congress. We know that they're having a difficult time. We also know that there's a potential for a lame duck session in Congress after the election, when we think it'll be much easier for the Congress to be able to deliver on the so-called FMAP extension. And so, we know that as we sit down with the Republicans and the governor to try to get some closure, that we need to have a discussion about how to account for whatever occurs in that.
Well, in addition to that, here's the very real situation. It's important for our Republican legislative leaders to join us in finding the votes in Congress to make that money real.
That's right.
If they do their job and help us with a California Republican congressional delegation, we can make up the votes that are short to get that passed. So the responsibility is for us to come up with a budget solution that is survivable, that draws down that federal money, but then also for all of us as leaders here to step up to the plate and get the votes necessary in Congress to fund that.
Rather than anything that's locked down.
It's not
It's a
locked down,
projection.
but it's more than a hope. It's an expectation.
You just talked about earlier in the silence is deafening, I think was your term.
I think did I say that? Oh yeah, I think I did. Oh man.
And I want to make sure I guess you're referring to legislative Republicans on this.
And the governor.
Well, but the governor would flip that and say, here we are 34 days past the deadline. You all said you were unified on June 30th.
And we were.
Where have you been on 34 days?
No, where we've been for 34 days is meeting with legislative Republican leaders, having every discussion about every potential issue that we can. And we've done everything we can to make sure that we heard some of the issues that they've raised and address some of those concerns in this new structure. So we've been working very diligently, consistently through the process. We've been very public about the ideas we had coming in. We've been very public about the joint values that we had going in, and now we're coming out with a very public document that gives you every single level of how we think we should do this budget in a way that closes this deficit, and we're now taking it to the conference committee process, which is appropriate.
I'll add one other thing, and that is, you know, and the public knows this, this isn't, the problem is very difficult, but getting to a solution is not that difficult. It's the chief executive of the state with only a couple months left to go in office, and he has not moved since the middle of May from an unacceptable May revise proposal. And if we're going to get to closure here, they need, and the Republicans need, to respond to what we've put on the table, suggest any tweaks or changes that they think are appropriate, and let's get the people's job done.
Mr. Speaker, could you talk a little bit about the NOL and the single sales factor, how long the suspension is, and doesn't this suspension idea undercut Proposition 4 and its goal to repeal it completely?
No, I mean, the reality is that the suspension is 1 year, and it's 1 year, I'm sorry, 2 years. And the idea is that you need to have some level of certainty. So if we didn't do the suspension and you still had the initiative out there, you'd have uncertainty and businesses wouldn't be able to actually understand what they can anticipate year to year. So we've got a 2-year suspension in there. Should the voters decide to do something different through the initiative process, then that action by the voters is dispositive.
If you get the suspension here legislatively, would you oppose the initiative, both of them?
I think that the initiative should be evaluated on its own merits.
But would you oppose it?
I'd have to look at that. I think you have to look at the total balance of what you do through this budget.
I think that package, frankly, needs to be reformed. I think the idea that, for example, on the single sales factor, that it's elective, where out-of-state companies can benefit as much as in-state companies, I think that package needs to be looked at and at a minimum reformed.
Thank you.
Don't know. Don't know yet.
We're expecting conference committee to act on it right away.
Right away. Thank you all.
Anybody